Now that you have received um, an introduction as to why a quadratic is called quadratic, being because of the squared term as opposed to linear and constant, let's talk about some vocabulary that exists with linear and constant as well. Um, but this purple bunch of letters here, A, B, and C, would represent constant values, and X is the variable in this thing here. And we call this, it's quadratic something. Hopefully, I'm impressed when for people who know this. It's called a quadratic expression. And this expression is written in standard form. Now, when we set the quadratic expression equal to 0, since we have an equal sign now, we now have a quadratic equation in standard form. Now, the blue guy here, he is also a quadratic equation, but he's a special type of quadratic equation. He's an equation with an input variable and an output variable. See this equation up here, he just has one variable. So there's no input-output thing going on. But this guy has an input variable and an output variable. So we don't just call him an equation. The input-output scenario, that is, oh my heavens, that is when we call it a function. So this is a quadratic function in standard form. Now, notice the only difference between the quadratic function and the quadratic equation is that the 0 versus y. If I flip the equation around so that it reads 0 equals, then notice all we do to go from the quadratic function to the quadratic equation is set y equal to 0. And that's very, very important to realize, because when y equals 0, if you're graphing a quadratic function, inputs and outputs, sometimes the output y will equal 0. Think about where you're located on the coordinate plane when that output y equals 0. Well, you're located on the x-axis. So if we can find solutions to this quadratic equation, we have found x-intercepts to this quadratic function. And there are multiple ways to find solutions to a quadratic equation, but one such way is by using the quadratic formula. Now, this is not the easiest way to find solutions. Sometimes you can do things like factor the quadratic to find solutions. But the quadratic formula will always work to find solutions, and if you haven't already memorized, you need to memorize it. And just for fun, I will sing the little jig that goes along with it to help memorize it. If the quadratic formula finds the values that x could equal to satisfy this equation. It finds the solutions to this quadratic equation. And the way the little song goes, we say it to the tune of All Around the Mulberry Bush. X equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So this quadratic formula is used to find solutions to quadratic equations, which in turn represent x-intercepts of quadratic functions in standard form. Okay, so big connection there. Now, okay, so now let's talk about the three different forms that a quadratic function can be written in, and each form has its advantages and disadvantages, which we'll talk about. I'll probably create a separate video for each form. But the three forms are the standard form, which I've already shown you, because this is the one that we distinguish from a linear function, and if we leave off the ax squared part, we've got linear. If we leave off the ax squared plus bx part, we've got a constant function. So this is the standard form, And remember that whether a is positive or negative determines whether this parabola is going to be opening upward or opening downward. And all three forms are going to have this same a in them. This form is called the vertex form, and the reason it's called the vertex form is because when the function is written in this form, the vertex, and the vertex, of course, is that either that bottom point or that top point on the parabola. If the parabola is opening upward, or if the parabola is opening downward, the vertex is, that's supposed to be green, the vertex is that bottom point if it's opening up, or that top point if it's opening down. So when the function is written in this form, the vertex is very easily, the vertex is included in the equation, essentially. Okay, we'll explain that. I'll explain that in another video. And the third form is the intercept form. And the reason this is called the intercept form is because in this form you can very easily identify the intercepts of the quadratic function. Specifically, we're talking about the x-intercepts. The x-intercepts, and I don't know why that's in green, but okay. So we've got standard form, vertex form, and intercept form, and each one is going to have its advantages and disadvantages. And I'll create a brief video explaining the advantages and disadvantages of each, and showing how you can use each of these three forms to create a graph of the quadratic function.